Hey, fellow math teachers. Welcome back for another deep dive. You ready to rethink note-taking?
Always ready.
All right, well, today we're looking at Chapter 11 of Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics. And this chapter is all about taking notes in a thinking classroom.
Note-taking is definitely something that we do a lot of in math class.
Yeah, it's one of those, staples, right?
Yeah.
You can't really imagine a math class without some point of note-taking.
Right. It's kind of like ingrained, from the time we're students ourselves.
Totally. And we see it, all throughout K-12, right?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's like this common thread.
absolutely. And in this chapter, we're specifically looking at this idea of I write, you write,
Classic.
the classic, where the teacher is writing notes on the board and students are copying them down.
Yep. And this is exactly what the research in the chapter is looking into. It's looking at this practice and kind of what it yields.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us have experienced this as both students and teachers, that sometimes students we so focused on getting everything down that they're not really thinking about what they're writing.
Totally.
But
Like they're missing the forest for the trees.
right. And the research that Peter shares is exactly that. More than half the students in his research who were copying notes were not keeping up with the explanations.
Oh, wow.
So they were so busy just trying to get the words down that they weren't even listening to what he was saying about the math.
So it's like the note-taking is almost like an impediment.
Right. It becomes the barrier rather than the tool to help them.
Yeah, and I think we've all been there, right, as students, where you're frantically trying to copy everything down and you're not really absorbing it. And as teachers, we've seen students kind of zone out and just go into that robot mode.
Totally. Like you just see them writing and you're like, are you even with me?
Exactly. And the chapter gives us some really powerful quotes from students that just drive this point home. Like Alana says, I just write what's on the board. I don't really think about it. I'm like a zombie, just copying everything down.
Wow, powerful quote.
Right. It really highlights that disconnect between the physical act of writing and the mental process of understanding.
And another student, Stephanie, shares that sometimes she just gives up on listening because she can't keep up.
That's so disheartening. But it's a reality for so many students.
It is. And that's what makes this research so important.
Yeah.
Because it's challenging us to think differently about how we approach note-taking.
Yeah, it's making us question whether this traditional method is actually serving our students.
Right, because if they're not understanding the math as they're taking notes, then what's the point?
Exactly. So how do we move away from this mindless copying and towards more meaningful note-taking?
Well, the chapter suggests a really interesting shift in perspective. It's this idea of encouraging students to take notes to their future forgetful selves.
That is such a cool concept. I love
Me
it.
too. It's so simple, but it's so powerful.
Right. It's like giving students this purpose for their notes. It's not just about getting something down on paper. It's about creating something that will actually be helpful to them later on.
Exactly. It's about thinking ahead and anticipating what their future selves might need to remember.
So instead of just being this passive recording of information notes, become this active tool for learning and remembering.
Right. And when students approach note-taking with this mindset, it changes everything.
Totally.
Yeah.
It encourages them to be more intentional about what they're writing and how they're organizing their thoughts.
Exactly. They start to think about what's important, what connections they're making, and how they can make the information stick.
It's like they're having this dialogue with their future selves, which is so meta when you think about it.
It is, but it works because it forces students to think about the material on a deeper level.
And it makes note-taking way more engaging.
Absolutely. It's no longer just a chore, it's a challenge, it's a puzzle, it's a way to make sense of the world.
So how do we actually help students make this shift from mindless copying to meaningful note-taking?
Well, the chapter highlights a few different approaches that were tested with various grade levels from grade 4 all the way up to grade 12.
Oh, wow. So they really looked at this across the board.
They did. And one of the things they found was that encouraging students to go beyond just copying definitions and procedures was really helpful.
Okay, so what kind of things did they have students try?
They had them experiment with creating their own examples, writing sentences to explain concepts in their own words, drawing pictures and diagrams.
I love that.
Yeah, and even summarizing key ideas in their own way.
So really encouraging them to personalize their notes and make them their own.
Right, because when students are actively processing the information and putting it into their own words, that's when the real learning happens.
Makes total sense. But I imagine that wasn't always easy for students who are so used to that traditional I write, you write method.
You're absolutely right. It was particularly challenging for the grade 8 and 9 students who had years of that ingrained habit.
Yeah, I can imagine, like trying to break a bad habit.
It is, and it takes time and patience and a lot of support from the teacher.
So what are some things that teachers can do to help students make that transition?
Well, one of the most effective strategies they found was using graphic organizers as a scaffolding tool.
Graphic organizers, I love those.
Yeah, they're a classic for a reason.
Right. They help students visualize the information and see how different concepts connect.
Exactly. And the chapter showcases some real examples of graphic organizers that were used in the research in figures 11.2, 11.3, 11.4, and 11.6.
Oh, cool. So there were some visuals for us to look at.
Yeah. And you can see how they vary depending on the content and the grade level.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
No, definitely not. It's about finding what works best for your students and the specific concepts you're teaching.
And I imagine that the graphic organizers can also help students to be more intentional about what they're writing.
Absolutely, because they provide a framework for organizing information and making connections.
So instead of just randomly jotting things down, students have a structure to guide their thinking.
Right. And that can make a huge difference in terms of how much they're actually learning and remembering.
This is all so fascinating. I'm really starting to see how note-taking can be so much more than just copying down information.
Me too. It's really about empowering students to be active participants in their own learning.
And to create something that will actually be useful to them in the future.
Exactly. And that's what makes this chapter so valuable. It's giving us a new vision for note-taking.
A vision that's more engaging, more meaningful, and ultimately more effective.
And a vision that can help our students to become better thinkers and learners.
Okay, I'm totally on board with this new vision, but I'm curious, how do we actually make it happen in the classroom?
Well, that's where those 3 essential competencies come in.
Ooh, I love a good competency list. Hit me with it. What are the magic ingredients for meaningful note-taking?
All right, so the first one is creation. We want students to move beyond just copying and start producing their own worked examples.
Okay, so they're not just passively transcribing steps, they're actively thinking through the process and creating their own representations of the concept.
Exactly. The second competency is annotation. We want students to use small phrases, side notes, and even little diagrams to clarify their thinking.
So it's like they're having a conversation with your notes, adding those little nuggets of insight that will make sense to them later on.
You got it. And finally, we have selection, which can be the trickiest of the 3. This is about students learning to choose the most appropriate worked example to guide them through a problem.
So instead of just grabbing the first example they see, they're actually evaluating which one best aligns with their understanding and the specific problem they're trying to solve.
Precisely. It's about developing that sense of discernment and making conscious choices about what information is most helpful to them.
This is all starting to paint a really clear picture of how we can empower students to become more thoughtful, intentional, and engaged note-takers. But I'm curious, is it all about individual work, or is there a role for collaboration in this new vision of note-taking?
That's a great question, and it leads us to another key aspect of this chapter. It's all about tapping into the collective wisdom of the classroom and turning note-taking into a shared learning experience.
So it's not just about students taking notes for themselves, but also with each other. I love that idea. It really aligns with the whole philosophy of a thinking classroom.
Exactly. So they actually had students work in random groups and encouraged them to refer back to their notes during discussions. This not only reinforces their own understanding, but it also exposes them to different perspectives and approaches.
It's like they're creating a collective knowledge base, building on each other's insights and clarifying any misconceptions along the way.
Exactly. And one of the strategies they used to facilitate this collaboration was something as simple as sticky notes. Students would jot down questions, insights, or connections they made while reviewing their notes, and then they'd share them with their group.
Sticky notes, such a simple tool, yet so powerful. It's amazing how something so low-tech can really spark those light bulb moments and get students thinking deeply.
Absolutely. And this whole idea of collaboration ties back to those 3 competencies we talked about earlier: creation, annotation, and selection. When students are working together, they're constantly creating new examples, annotating each other's work, and selecting the most effective strategies to solve problems.
It's like they're creating a dynamic web of knowledge where everyone's contributions are valued and everyone benefits from the shared learning experience.
And that's when the real magic happens. Students start to see note-taking not as a chore, but as a collaborative tool for problem-solving and sense-making.
Okay, I'm totally on board with this vision of note-taking as a collaborative and engaging process. But let's be realistic, it's going to take more than just handing out sticky notes and telling students to work together, right?
You're right. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. The chapter emphasizes the importance of careful planning and scaffolding, especially for students who are new to this way of thinking about notes.
So what are some practical strategies that teachers can use to make this transition as smooth as possible?
Well, one of the key things is to be very explicit about the purpose of note-taking. We need to move away from that mindset of taking notes for the teacher and help students understand that they're taking notes for themselves to support their own learning and understanding.
I love that. It's all about giving students ownership of the process and empowering them to become active participants in their own education.
Exactly. And that's where those three competencies come back into play. We need to provide opportunities for students to practice creating their own worked examples, annotating their notes in a way that makes sense to them, and selecting the most helpful strategies for their own learning style.
So it's about creating a learning environment where students feel comfortable experimenting, making mistakes, and figuring out what works best for them.
Absolutely. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. Students aren't going to become expert note takers overnight. There will be bumps along the way, moments of frustration, and maybe even a few longing glances back at those old I write, you write days.
But that's all part of the process.
Right?
It's about fostering a growth mindset and encouraging students to embrace the challenges and celebrate their progress.
Exactly. And the more we can model that growth mindset as teachers, the more likely our students are to adopt it themselves.
This chapter is really challenging me to rethink my own assumptions about note-taking. I've always seen it as a fairly straightforward skill, but this deep dive has shown me just how complex and nuanced it can be.
And it's so much more than just a skill. It's a way of thinking, a way of engaging with material, a way of making connections and building understanding.
I'm particularly intrigued by the emphasis on worked examples. I've always used them in my teaching, but this chapter has given me a whole new perspective on their value.
Yes. Worked examples are so much more than just showing students how to do something. They're an opportunity to unpack the why behind the what.
So it's not just about memorizing steps, it's about understanding the underlying concepts and principles that drive those steps.
Precisely. And when students can create their own worked examples, annotate them to clarify their thinking, and select the most appropriate examples to guide them through similar problems, they're developing a much deeper and more flexible understanding of the material.
That makes so much sense. It's like they're building a toolbox of strategies that they can draw upon whenever they encounter a new challenge.
Exactly. And the chapter provides some really practical suggestions for how teachers can help students develop these competencies. For example, you could give students a choice of worked examples to incorporate into their notes, or you could have them correct incorrect examples to really test their understanding.
Oh, I love the idea of having them correct incorrect examples. It's such a powerful way to surface misconceptions and get students thinking critically about the steps involved.
Right. And it also creates a great opportunity for peer feedback and discussion. You could even have students annotate each other's work, providing constructive criticism and suggestions for improvement.
It's all about creating that culture of feedback and reflection, where students are actively engaged in the learning process and supporting each other's growth.
Exactly. And as students become more comfortable with this new way of thinking about notes, their confidence will grow and they'll start to see the real value in taking notes for themselves.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. It's so easy to get stuck in those traditional routines. But this chapter has inspired me to try some new things and empower my students to become more active and engaged note-takers.
And that's what it's all about, right? Creating a learning environment where students aren't just passive recipients of information, but active constructors of their own knowledge.
Exactly. And this chapter is packed with practical strategies and actionable insights that teachers can implement in their classrooms right away.
Yes. There's even a try this section at the end of the chapter with specific activities for different grade levels. For example, for grades K-5, there's an activity involving dot patterns and writing number sentences.
And for grades 6 to 9, there's a fun one with pennies, where students have to figure out how much money is left on a table after a series of coin replacements.
And for the older students, grades 10-12, there's a challenging problem involving a bank robber and a swimming pool. It requires them to think critically and strategically about how to maximize their chance of escape.
I love how those activities connect the note-taking strategies to real-world scenarios.
Yeah.
It helps students see that these skills aren't just for math class, but for life.
Exactly. And by providing these opportunities for exploration and application, we can help students develop the skills and habits they need to make note, taking a powerful tool for learning in all subjects.
So to wrap things up, what's the one key message you want our listener to take away from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that if we want our students to really own their learning, We need to empower them to own their note-taking.
It's about moving beyond that, just copying.
Right. We're trying to get them to be active and engaged and creative.
Yeah, and to see note-taking not as a chore, but as a tool.
A tool that they can use
To make sense of the math and to help them remember it.
And I think that's really what this chapter is all about. It's about giving students the skills and the strategies they need to make note-taking meaningful and effective.
So for our listeners out there who are ready to ditch the mindless copying and embrace this new vision of note-taking, what advice would you give them? Where should they start?
I think the first step is just to be aware of the research.
Yeah, to understand why this traditional I write, you write method is often falling short.
And once you have that understanding, you can start to experiment with some of the strategies we've talked about.
Like encouraging students to create their own examples.
Yeah, or using graphic organizers to help them organize their thoughts.
And don't be afraid to let students make mistakes.
That's right. Note-taking is a skill, and like any skill, it takes practice and patience.
And remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. You're not going to see results overnight.
But if you stick with it and you keep providing students with the support they need, they will eventually get there.
And they'll start to see the real value in taking notes for themselves.
And that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Empowering students to become more active and engaged learners.
Absolutely. Because when they own their note-taking, they own their learning.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I'm really excited to go back and try some of these strategies in my own classroom. What about you?
Me too. I'm feeling inspired.
All right, well, we hope you are too, listeners. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into building thinking classrooms in mathematics.
And until next time, keep thinking deeply and keep challenging the status quo.
And keep those thinking caps on. We'll see you soon, Nara.